Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. A few weeks ago, the National Alliance of Concurrent Enrollment Partnerships, commonly known as NACEP, released a report with a title that I think captures one of the biggest tensions in American education right now. Beyond Rigor: Closing the Quality Gap in State Dual Enrollment Policy. And I've been thinking about that title ever since, because for years now, so much of the conversation around advanced coursework, acceleration, and college readiness has revolved around rigor. More rigor, higher rigor, greater rigor. We've almost treated the word itself as synonymous with educational quality. If students are taking harder classes, earning more college credit, or moving faster through academic pathways, then surely that must mean things are improving. But what the report argues, and I think what many educators suspect, is that rigor by itself is not enough. In fact, rigor without quality, support, coherence, and intentionality can sometimes create experiences that look impressive on paper while feeling less meaningful in practice. And that realization sits at the heart of this summer school series. For the next few episodes, I want to explore not just dual enrollment itself, but what the explosive growth of dual enrollment says about the broader direction of American education. Because I don't think this is simply a story about students taking college classes in high school anymore. I think it's a story about acceleration becoming one of the defining logics of modern schooling. Now, before we go further, it's probably helpful to explain who NACEP is and why this report matters. NACEP is the leading organization focused specifically on concurrent and dual enrollment quality standards. For years, they've worked at the intersection of K-12 and higher education, trying to answer a deceptively difficult question. What actually makes college coursework offered in high school legitimate, meaningful, and transferable? And that question has become much more urgent because dual enrollment is no longer a niche opportunity. Not long ago, earning college credit in high school was often reserved for a relatively small group of highly advanced students. Maybe students at a specialized residential STEM school. Maybe students taking AP or IB coursework in especially high-performing districts. Maybe a handful of academically accelerated students at a local community college. But over the past decade especially, something changed. States have begun embracing acceleration policies at scale. Legislators realized dual enrollment was politically attractive because it seemed to solve several problems simultaneously. Families liked the possibility of lowering college costs. Workforce advocates liked the faster pipeline into credentials and degrees. Policymakers liked the metrics. Schools liked being able to market advanced opportunities. And colleges liked enrollment pipelines. And suddenly, what once felt exceptional started to feel like it was becoming expected. Today, it is increasingly common for students to graduate high school with significant college credit already completed. In some states, students can earn an associate degree while still enrolled in high school. In Arkansas, the Access Act and broader acceleration movement have only intensified that momentum. More students than ever are entering accelerated pathways earlier and earlier. Now, to be clear, much of this expansion is genuinely positive. I want to be careful here because I've spent much of my career advocating for talent development, advanced learning opportunities, and expanded access to acceleration. I've seen firsthand what happens when students are finally given access to work that truly challenges them. I've watched students from rural communities, low-income backgrounds, and first-generation college families discover entirely new possibilities for themselves because advanced coursework opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. So this is not an anti-acceleration conversation, but I do think we've reached a moment where it's fair to ask a deeper question. What happens when acceleration stops being an opportunity and starts becoming an expectation? Because that shift changes the emotional and cultural experience of education in very profound ways. There was a time when taking college coursework in high school largely signaled distinction. It meant that a student was pursuing something beyond the norm. Today, in many communities, students and families increasingly feel pressure simply to keep up. Sophomores are building college transcripts. Students are strategically calculating transferable credits before they can legally vote. Parents are trying to optimize pathways earlier and earlier because they fear falling behind in an increasingly competitive environment. And honestly, I think we underestimate how dramatically this has reshaped adolescence. One of the subtle points embedded throughout this report is that dual enrollment now operates across multiple overlapping systems simultaneously. It's not just an educational initiative anymore. It's tied to economic development, college affordability, workforce pipelines, political accountability systems, and public perceptions of school quality. Now, that means that acceleration is no longer simply about learning. It's increasingly about efficiency, and efficiency has become one of the dominant values shaping education today. How quickly can students move? How many credits can they accumulate? How much money can families save? How early can degrees be completed? How optimized can the pathway become? Now again, none of these are inherently bad questions, but they are incomplete questions. Because education was never supposed to be purely transactional. One of the things I've observed repeatedly over the past 20 years working with highly motivated students is something that actually runs counter to the broader public narrative. Many students who enter college with substantial credits already completed don't necessarily want to rush through the experience. In fact, many of them intentionally slow down once they arrive. As I described on a recent episode, they double major, they study abroad, they pursue research, explore outside disciplines, take interesting electives unrelated to their eventual careers. They invest more deeply in relationships, mentorships, and experiences. And I think it's fascinating because it suggests something important, that maybe the healthiest use of acceleration is not escaping education faster, but creating more freedom within education itself. That's a very different philosophy than simple optimization. But the report also raises another major concern: quality inconsistency. NACEP used a phrase that I think is incredibly insightful. They describe the current environment as kind of a, quote, quality lottery. Now, in other words, two students may both graduate with 30 hours of college credit, but the actual educational value of those experiences may differ dramatically, depending on where they live, the strength of the institutional partnerships, the quality of the advising, instructor preparation, transferability policies, and support structures. And that matters enormously. Because if the public conversation only focuses on quantity, credits earned, participation rates, accelerated degrees, then we risk confusing accumulation with transformation. And I think that distinction may define the next decade of this particular educational debate. Are students genuinely experiencing deeper learning, greater intellectual maturity, stronger agency, clearer purpose? Or are they simply becoming more efficient navigators of increasingly complex educational systems? And those are not the same thing. And to me, that's really the bigger story underneath this report. We're living through a moment where the traditional boundary between high school and college is beginning to blur. The stages themselves are compressing, and while there are tremendous opportunities within that shift, there are also important questions we haven't fully answered yet about readiness, identity, exploration, belonging, and the developmental purpose of education itself. So in our next episode, I want to dig more deeply into one of the report's most important underlying ideas: the growing difference between accumulating credits and experiencing meaningful learning. Because I think we may be entering an era where students are becoming ever more fluent in how to move through educational systems strategically, while sometimes having less time and space to fully discover who they are becoming along the way. And that's where this conversation gets much bigger than dual enrollment alone. A Slice with Dice is a production of Aldercube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.